I think many of us are feeling the pinch of Bidenomics. Boy, do they wish they could get away from that refrain. But today I have a special guest with me, Jim Pinkerton, to go through what's going on with the economy, what's going on with the markets, what's going on with President Biden. Jim, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
So Jim is a writer, an author, a trader, understands economic topics probably better than Biden's guy, Jared Bernstein, who, just did that interview and they asked him all these money questions. And then it turns out he was like a music teacher. Doesn't even have a background in finance.
There are many paths to big jobs at the White House.
All right. So something I read today that is concerning to me is I read that President Biden is purposely draining the entire Northeast gasoline reserve in a bid to lower gas prices as he heads into the 2024 election, since he is struggling to maintain his edge against Donald Trump. Do you think that this whole thing is about being reelected? Is this about doing good for the American wallet? Or is this just putting the United States in a precarious energy situation?
Well, if we are in a precarious energy situation, it's because of sort of Biden-ish policies that they came in. I mean, the Biden administration saying we want to go green, we want to be carbon neutral by 2035. All these green buzz phrases they were using, they pretty quickly collided with higher gas prices, which are unpopular and kind of a loser. And so they've sort of been backpedaling ever since. And now there's sort of a struggle within the Biden administration between the people who want to lower gas prices just for the sake of his own reelection and the more sincere green ideologues who are still dreaming of electric cars and windmills and so on. And so it's almost a sort of a Jimmy Carter-ish administration where there's one half is thinking one policy and the other half is thinking another. And so they come up with sort of half-baked compromises like this, draining the petroleum reserve, as you mentioned. And the amount of gasoline they're talking about is about 3 hours of consumption for the nation, 3 hours. So it's a very symbolic thing that really won't have any impact on gas prices, but will only hopefully underscore the fact that if we'd wanted to, we could have been producing all the more oil and gas, and for that matter, clean coal, if we'd wanted to, pushing down prices, which not only would have helped American consumers, but also would have helped, oppose Russia. Back in the 1980s, in the Reagan administration, President Reagan had a strategy of undermining the Soviet Union by producing more oil here and undermining Soviet oil prices, which helped collapse the USSR, which is, of course, a good thing. And we could be doing that now, but unfortunately, John Kerry and Green donors have more influence over the Biden administration much of the time.
Yeah. I like how John Kerry takes these private jet trips that burn more pollution than anyone he's telling to not drive over their entire life. I mean, the whole thing seems hypocritical, and yet I guess he doesn't want to be on these Boeing 737s that keep having issues. The other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on are many Americans are frustrated. They say this upcoming election is going to be about kitchen table issues. Well, it seems like inflation, the economy, the cost of goods seems to be right at the very top. Why do you believe the Federal Reserve is having such a hard time flushing this inflation issue out of the system? Is it just the amount of money that the Biden administration continues to print? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, during COVID, we put 10 trillion into the economy, 10 trillion and extra. And that's a lot of money. And inflationary expectations. The Biden administration wants to spend 7 trillion. They're acting like, again, it's this level of sort of, the political science word is disjunction between the people who think inflation is bad and a negative for the country and for Biden's reelection prospects, and other people who say, well, if you inflate the currency, you in effect reduce the debt. You inflate your way out of your deficit. Which is what the Germans did in the early 1920s with pretty disastrous consequences down the road. And then there's a third group that says, well, maybe we should cut spending and be fiscally disciplined, but that would get in the way of spending more on education and, transgender rights and, anything else they can think of. And so you have and of course, overlying, and I think this is probably the biggest single factor. I mean, it is a true statement that unemployment is low and inflation, it's been worse in the past. Biden's approval rating should be higher. The problem is Biden himself, and there's a lot of what Keynes called animal spirits in the economy. And if the leader of the country is seen as just not effective, to put it politely, it undermines morale. It undermines business confidence and consumer confidence. And so you can, in many ways, the unemployment isn't that much different than it was under Trump. But Trump was seen as a strong leader who's always touting the economy and talking about how great it is, and that made people feel good about it. And Biden is just the opposite.
Yeah. There's two big buzzwords that, as I read articles and prepare for my show, I see continuously coming up. One is this idea of defunding the police. The other is this DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I see these kind of woven through so many articles, some of them kind of sneaky. What are your thoughts on this? Because to me, I would think that we would want more police, better trained, less crime, and that every job that you and I could list off, we would want the person to merit being in that position, have the talent, the skills, the experience, versus just based off their sexual orientation or their skin color or their gender. What are your two thoughts on these big buzzwords?
Well, I mean, you're out there in, I think, Utah, and therefore probably most of the people around you kind of think the same way. And if you lived in Maryland or Massachusetts, most of the people would think differently. I mean, this is I wrote a book with the subtitle "The Red Blue Rumble" to get the point across that yes, half the country, maybe a little more than half, is strongly opposed to DEI and strongly in favor of colorblind merit. And and I would agree with you. And I would agree with them. However, a big chunk of the country is genuinely woke. I mean, I was just looking at a poll from Siena College, which is a school in New York that does a lot of public opinion polling. And if you look at opinion in New York State, they are strong in favor of DEI and all this stuff. This is a diversity, means ideological and intellectual diversity too. And so you just run across people who just think the opposite. And, that's why we have states and federalism, is to allow people in California to have one view of things and people in Utah or, South Carolina to have another view. And actually it's given just, the value of small d democracy, it's kind of good that people can, have a local government that reflects their views and values. And I also think it represents a significant economic challenge and opportunities. It's a significant challenge to, for example, Disney. Disney has gone sort of woke, we can say, in the last, 5 or 10 years. And they've kind of wrecked a lot of their, they wrecked the Star Wars franchise out of that. A multi-billion-dollar purchase is is now not worth that much. And it not only has hurt Disney in terms of, its appeal in red state America, but by the same token, it's also an opportunity for, out there in Utah, Angel Studios, which is, a tiny fraction of the size of Disney, but nonetheless has gotten mind share and profitability with movies like The Song of Freedom and Sound of Freedom. And so, again, this sort of differential between the states opens up, different investment opportunities, and also, frankly, arbitrage opportunities. You go to California for your, green energy subsidy and your abortion, and then you go to, Utah for your tax cut and your gun. It's actually kind of the way freedom could kind of work.
Yeah, interesting. That's a great perspective. I appreciate you sharing that. When it comes to picking companies to invest in or believe in, one thing that we just watched that I guess I haven't really seen during my investing years is these companies that suddenly boomed during the lockdowns. For example, Moderna, Etsy, Zoom, DocuSign, Peloton, these companies became worth significant amounts of money compared to what they are now. How do you go about analyzing to make sure that you're not getting into something that is, for lack of a better word, a meme stock or a fad? Or do you get in and get out really quickly? How do you go about
Well,
researching on that?
I take a lot of inspiration, and I give him full credit in my book. Is Peter Lynch, who wrote Up and One Up on Wall Street and several other books since back in the 1980s. He was a phenomenally successful investor on behalf of Magellan. I mean, it just had a 29% return for 20 years in a row. And his, point was, let's begin by noticing things. Begin by noticing that if the examples he uses in the book from 35 years ago, if women like legs, pantyhose, then that's a good bet, a good argument for Hanes. And then you have to do every other kind of due diligence, of course, but you just start with just the basic wisdom: the trend is your friend. And so you can begin by, obviously if the trend, if the trend is your friend, it's better to be in the tech business, for example, than the buggy whip business, right? I mean, there's just a better business. And so I go through the history of this, pointing out, for example, that beginning in the early 19th century, the United States made a sort of collective unconscious decision to move into railroads. Culminating in the Transcontinental Railroad out there in Promontory Point, Utah, in 1869. It was an exciting moment, and along the way, during the 19th century, we built 215,000 miles of railroads. 215,000 miles. That's using pickaxes and shovels. There's no technology to speak of in terms of mechanical, and that's a pretty good business to be in. In the 20th century, we built 3 million miles of roads, and for good measure, 250 million parking spaces. I mean, so you could just identify in railroads in the 19th century, automobiles and asphalt in the 20th century. Today, the internet. And now, it's obviously the internet has been the greatest, wealth creation thing, in probably maybe in human history. But you begin with a basic point about a trend, and then you start thinking about companies within that. And that's that's the category of, in the book, trends to spot. I think there are also trends to shape, and that is trends that you can see politics changing the game on this. A great example next to Utah is Nevada. In 1931, Nevada had more tumbleweeds than people. The population of Las Vegas was 5,000, and an acre of land on what was then called the Los Angeles Highway was $75. Now the Las Vegas metro area is 2.2 million. An acre of land on the Strip, they call it now, is $30 million. And so you can see the change they made. And again, Las Vegas legalizing gambling back in 1931 is not the only way to think about economic development. Utah actually has a higher per capita income than Nevada does. So there's plenty of ways. You fill up your state with Mormons, you're going to also be prosperous. And so there's lots of ways to think about how to do this. But you can start with, where is trend headed? I gave another good example in front of us now is Wyoming and banking secrecy. Wyoming is now making a major play to be sort of a Switzerland of banking. We'll see if they can pull it off. If they do, that's something for investors to study, including just something as simple as the real estate nearby. You don't have to pick the bank. You just have to simply say, there's a reason why, Jackson Hole, Wyoming is so prosperous now, because, millionaires and billionaires are moving there. And that makes, a good business is to be in the real estate business or get the Tesla dealership or whatever it is that would be associated with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great way to look at it. In fact, Utah's about to go through another huge boom because in the south end of the Salt Lake Valley, there was this massive prison system, and they said, wait a minute, we got all these people in prison here. We can move them out in the desert. And then all of a sudden, all these tech companies were like, we would move there. And all of a sudden, income is rising. Companies that don't want to have the high bills of San Francisco are moving to Provo and Lehigh and Draper. So it's interesting to watch that trend in real time. Another trend that is just maybe starting that I wanted to get your feedback on is this morning, Target announced that they are worried about weak consumers and they are rolling back the prices on over 500 items in order to compete with Walmart. Is this a trend that they believe over the next 12 months, people are going to have less discretionary income?
Well, I think, retail is under a lot of pressure, that's for sure, from Amazon and, and lesser, delivery systems. Look, it's, the Biden administration has had sort of a policy of a fair amount of inflation, a lot of immigration, and it is driving up housing prices. It is driving up, retail prices. They're making it, yeah. So there's a trend to observe there that, and when Democrats are in, it's a more inflationary time, that's for sure. And that will put a squeeze on, low income workers and wage workers and so on. They will have trouble, and that will force, economies there. I think it's a lot of it, though, again, is sectoral. In other words, an example of a nationwide company, you mentioned Target, another nationwide company is BlackRock, the investment house, $10 trillion operation. And they clearly chose to go woke, if you will, in the last 5 or 10 years. And it's worth noting, plenty of people loved it. Giant pension funds in places like California and New York loved the fact that BlackRock was, if you will, becoming Blue Rock, sort of a democratic operation. And yet there's also backlash. Texas, Louisiana, West Virginia, to name 3 red states, have said we're going to pull our pension money out of BlackRock. And so the point being that if BlackRock becomes Blue Rock, it then opens up the opportunity for, if you will, a Red Rock. And it'll probably be in a state with no state income tax. And that's a issue for Utah to consider, because Wyoming doesn't have one, Nevada doesn't have one, South Dakota doesn't have one. And so, but when you see Carl Icahn moving from, New York to Florida, and Ken Griffin moving from Chicago to Florida, and you see Evergreen Investment moving from Washington, and Jeff Bezos moving from Washington State to Florida and Texas, respectively, you're starting to see these trends. Again, a lot of us, you mentioned, the economic development opportunities in Utah based on moving a prison. Prison is not, in some places, prisons are big economic drivers, right? If you're in a poor state, you kind of want a prison in your state just for jobs. But if you have the luxury of, higher end jobs and higher end workers, then yeah, you want to get the prison as far away from, the population centers you can and use it for that land. Those are the kind of choices that, back in 1932, Supreme Court Justice Brandeis said the states will be the laboratories of democracy. And again, in the book, I argue they're also the laboratories of prosperity. You get 50 different states trying 50 different strategies to see what works best for them, including their political considerations, and just everything that goes into how a state's makeup actually is better for the overall economy. It had sort of diversity and competition. It's a form of free enterprise among the 50 states.
Yeah. Okay, you have a new book coming out at the end of this month, The Secret of Directional Investing, Making Money Amidst the Red Blue Rumble. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I've got this weird background here, this Aurora background, which I know is making me look kind of ghostly. So yes, it's a book coming out, The Secret of Directional Investing, coming out May 28th. It argues that, again, investing is about trends. Investing is about identifying the direction. And so, I've mentioned, railroads in the past. I've mentioned highways in the past. We can also talk about another trend right in front of us, bicycles. Bicycles are sort of a humble transportation mode, but they're very popular in certain circles. And anywhere here on the East Coast, they're every time we turn around, they've taken a street off of the grid and turned into a bicycle path and so on. It's just a big thing here in the Washington area and a lot of other places too. And so you can clearly see that there, mayors and local governments are putting a lot of emphasis and credence on bicycles. And so there's an investment trend there. In the spirit of Peter Lynch, there are John Nesbitt's and megatrends. There's just a trend. Another book that I give full credit to. There's a lot to be observed. And yes, if people are, working from home, and there's this concept of 15-minute cities, in terms, then people just won't be commuting downtown anymore. They will be working from home more. That's an obvious trend, including people in Utah, telecommuting to Silicon Valley and so on. But they'll still want to go places. They'll still want to go to Starbucks or, the local lunch cafe or something, or just ride their bicycle around just to get the exercise. It will be a different vision of living patterns, that you're starting to see that in San Francisco. Curiously enough, the downtown core of San Francisco is, just terrible, but the outer parts of the city, like the Presidio, are booming because the tech boom is so strong. And this is something to keep in mind, is that California was the 7th largest economy in the world in 2014, and 10 years later, the headlines are about homelessness and poverty and crime and everything. And yet, because the tech boom is so strong, the trend there is so strong, California is actually now the 5th largest economy in the country. The quality of life of the average Californian may well have declined, but NVIDIA, Apple, these other companies are so valuable that they have pushed up the overall economy. And that's something for, a state like Utah to consider, which is, how do we keep from being just eaten, if you will, by, some AI in somebody else's state?
Yeah, yeah. One of the chapter titles that you have is Meat Space and Cyberspace. What's that one has me curious. What one is that about?
Well, meat space is the sort of tech word for sort of real life. You and I are, and their somewhat cynical, geeky terminology, you and I and every other human being are meat puppets. Okay. And so we have, and so the point I make is cyberspace, the internet, look, we all know the value of it. We all know the impact. The one thing that is sort of a constant is that as long as people control it, which may not be forever, who knows, right, with robots and AI and stuff, but as long as people control it, they will want to be in the picture. And that's the mistake that Facebook made, going back, late teens, which is they said we're going to switch to virtual reality, and then and you're supposed to have fun on Meta as opposed to Facebook, enjoying virtual reality and stuff, and it's just so ridiculous it didn't work. And only somebody out of that world would think that ordinary people want to live as avatars. It's just not correct. So always bet on people, including in space, by the way, same idea. If space exploration just consists of robots and lasers and whatever going out to space, people won't like it. They're not going to pay to say the robot got to go to Mars. They're going to pay, Elon Musk is going to say, I want to go to Mars. And so just, the Greek philosopher Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. And so if you just extend that to people, we will always want to be in the picture, and that will always there's going to be a market for space tourism, for faces on the internet, whatever it is. It will never be just robots and tech, in spite of the best efforts of certain tech moguls who then learned how to switch. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, it's nice to be running a company when you're late 30s, because after the debacle of all this metaverse stuff, Facebook has pivoted to AI and is now booming again. And there's a trend to watch going down and a trend to watch going up.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I thought it was going to be about the fake meat craze, Impossible or whatever it's called, meat.
Well, that is an issue. It's not in the book, but that is an interesting issue of, there's plenty of arguments for and against, artificial meat. It's human. It's if you're a vegetarian, it's not so bad, and you're not killing animals. It's, Florida has made a choice to ban, artificial meat, and that, choice Florida can make, I guarantee other states are going to say it's great, and we'll just see where the industry is 10 years from now.
Yeah, yeah. I love the idea of 50 different states taking 50 different paths, and then we get to collect the data and see what worked and what didn't work. Jim, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to put a link down to your book so people can get it as it comes out. If people want to follow you online, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm on Twitter at James P. Pinkerton, at James P. Pinkerton, and I'm on Facebook too, but much more active on Twitter.
Okay, I'll put that down as well. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you very much.